Mafia Bloodlines. New York City, 1961. The city never slept. Sirens echoed through the narrow streets, the elevated trains screeched overhead, and the smell of gasoline, sweat, and roasted chestnuts blended into something only New Yorkers could understand. In the heart of Brooklyn, where the immigrant families lived shoulder to shoulder in crumbling tenements, a boy named Anthony Marino was learning what it meant to survive. Anthony's father, Salvatore, had crossed the Atlantic from Sicily after the war. He had carried nothing but a worn suitcase, a crucifix, and the memory of hunger that had carved deep lines into his face. America promised opportunity, but in truth it offered only another form of struggle. The factory jobs barely paid enough to keep food on the table. The landlords bled the tenants dry, and the Irish cops patrolled the streets with truncheons that seemed to fall harder on Italian skulls than anyone else's. Anthony grew up watching his father's pride dissolve in whiskey bottles and unpaid bills. By the age of 12, Anthony had already decided. He would never be poor, and he would never beg another man for dignity. First lessons. The neighborhood taught faster than school ever could. On street corners, older boys in sharp suits leaned against Cadillacs, smoking Lucky Strikes, their pockets fat with cash. They weren't doctors or lawyers, yet their mothers walked with their heads high, their families respected, their tables overflowing with food. These men were soldiers of the local famiglia, and in the silence of dinner conversations, Anthony heard their names spoken with both fear and admiration. One of them, Vito Romano, noticed Anthony early. Romano was no ordinary thug. He was a capo in training, running gambling dens and collecting debts for the Marino family's local syndicate. He saw the hunger in Anthony's eyes, a mix of desperation and ambition, and one afternoon he pulled the boy aside. "Kid," Romano said, lighting a cigarette, "you keep looking at us like you want something. You want to shine my shoes, or you want to learn how the world really works." Anthony didn't hesitate. "I want what you got." Romano smiled. "Then you better learn two things: loyalty and silence. Without those, you're dead before you're 20. Blood on the pavement." Anthony's first job wasn't glamorous. He ran errands, delivering envelopes stuffed with cash to back rooms of bars, carrying messages nobody else could be trusted with. But even at 14, he knew every street, every alley, every man who owed money and every man who had power. It didn't take long before the real test came. One evening, Romano took him along to collect a debt from a butcher who had fallen behind on payments. The man begged for more time, swore on his children he'd pay next week. Romano didn't flinch. He grabbed the butcher by the hair, slammed his head against the counter, and handed Anthony the bloodied knife. Lesson number 1, kid. Mercy makes you poor. You want respect. You take what's yours. Anthony's hand trembled, but he carved a thin line across the butcher's cheek. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was enough. Blood dripped onto the cold tile floor. The butcher's eyes filled with terror. That night, Anthony couldn't sleep. He replayed the man's screams again and again. But with every replay, the fear inside him shrank, and the power grew. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Family ties. At home, his mother noticed the changes. "Anthony, where do you get this money? These shoes, this jacket? You think I don't see?" But Anthony only kissed her cheek and promised everything would be all right. Deep down, he justified it. He was doing what his father never could. He was giving his family respect, a name that meant something. By 16, Anthony was already more provider than his father. And though Salvatore never asked, he knew. One night, drunk and bitter, he spat at Anthony. "You think you're a man because you run with gangsters? I left Sicily so you wouldn't live like an animal. You think honor comes from blood money." Anthony stared at him, calm and cold. "At least I don't break my back for scraps. At least people listen when I speak." Salvatore had no answer. In that silence, Anthony knew he had already taken his father's place. Baptism of fire. Every man in the life has a moment where he becomes more than an errand boy. For Anthony, it came on a rain-slicked night in 1963. Romano handed him a pistol, cold steel heavier than anything Anthony had ever held. "There's a guy downtown who thinks he can cross us," Romano said. You want to be part of this family? Then prove it. No second chances. The target was a bookie who had stopped paying his share. Anthony found him outside a bar, half drunk, fumbling with his car keys. The city lights blurred in the rain, the sound of jazz leaking from the bar door. Anthony raised the gun. For a split second, he saw the man not as a debt, but as a father, a brother, a human being. Then he remembered Romano's words. Loyalty. Silence. The trigger clicked, the shot echoed like thunder, and the man crumpled into the gutter. Anthony didn't flinch. Not anymore. That night, he became a soldier. Not officially, not yet. But inside, he knew the blood on his hands had baptized him into the life. A new name in the streets. By 18, people in Brooklyn whispered the name Anthony Marino with both fear and respect. He was no longer just the son of an immigrant. He was a rising star, a boy who had proven himself willing to do what others couldn't. But the life wasn't just about violence. It was about politics, power, alliances. Romano began teaching him the deeper rules. How to bribe a cop, how to negotiate territory, how to read a man's weakness before he even spoke. The streets are a chessboard, Romano told him one night over whiskey. And most men are pawns. You, Anthony, you could be more. But only if you keep your heart cold. Anthony nodded. He already felt it happening. The boy inside him was dying, and in his place a man was being born. A man who belonged not to the law, not to his family, but to the bloodlines of the Mafia. Part 1 ends here, but the story is only beginning. The streets of New York are about to erupt in violence, and Anthony Marino is ready to rise. Building the family. Brooklyn, New York, 1965. The summer heat clung to the streets like a curse. Garbage piled high on corners, rats the size of cats ran between alleyways, and kids played stickball barefoot on asphalt that burned like fire. Amid this chaos, Anthony Marino was no longer a boy. At 19, he carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. And where he belonged was the family. Sworn in blood. One night, Romano brought him to a dimly lit basement beneath a social club. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Around a scarred wooden table sat 5 men, each with faces carved from stone. These were not street thugs. These were capos, captains of the Marino crime family. In the center sat Don Carmine Marino, the boss himself. His hair was silver, his eyes sharp as glass, his suit tailored like a king's armor. When he spoke, the room fell silent. Anthony, Carmine said, his voice smooth but heavy, you've been brought here tonight because you've shown loyalty. You've proven courage. But once you take this step, there is no turning back. You become part of this family, closer than blood. Do you understand? Anthony nodded. His pulse hammered in his ears. A small card with a saint's image was placed in his palm. Romano lit it on fire, and Anthony closed his fist around the burning picture. The flames licked his skin, searing flesh. Repeat after me, Don Carmine said. If I betray this family, may my soul burn as this saint burns. Anthony repeated the words, his voice steady despite the pain. When the card turned to ash, Carmine leaned forward. From this day, you are one of us. A soldier. Our blood, our brother. Applause echoed softly. Glasses of red wine were raised. Anthony Marino had been baptized into the Mafia, not with holy water, but with fire and blood. Business of the streets. The Marino family's empire stretched across Brooklyn, Staten Island, and parts of Manhattan. Gambling dens, loan sharking operations, union rackets, it all flowed upward, every dollar a drop of blood feeding the beast. Anthony's first assignment as a soldier was running a numbers racket in Bensonhurst. It was simple math. Poor people bet nickels and dimes on daily numbers, and the family collected thousands. If someone couldn't pay, Anthony made sure they learned the cost of disrespect. But it wasn't just violence. Anthony was smart. He memorized names, faces, habits. He slipped envelopes into the right hands, beat cops who looked the other way, politicians who needed campaign donations. By 21, he wasn't just feared on the street. He was respected in boardrooms of smoke-filled backrooms. Romano once told him, Muscle makes you feared, but brains, that makes you untouchable. Anthony had both. Love and shadows. Not everything in Anthony's life was business. One night at a nightclub in Manhattan, he met Maria Conti, a singer with dark eyes and a voice that melted the room. She wasn't like the neighborhood girls. She carried herself with class, with fire. For the first time, Anthony felt something close to weakness. He courted her with dinners, with flowers, with promises of a life she could only dream of. And for a while, Maria believed him. But Maria wasn't blind. She knew the whispers, the late nights, the money that came from nowhere. "Anthony," she asked one evening, "what are you really doing?" He kissed her hand and lied. "Business. That's all you need to know." Maria frowned. "Business that leaves blood on your shoes?" Anthony didn't answer. In her silence, he saw the danger. Love made a man vulnerable. Still, he couldn't let her go. She became both his strength and his weakness, the only piece of innocence left in a life built on shadows. The First War. In the late 60s, tension boiled between the Marino family and the Vitali crew, a rival faction operating out of Queens. The Vitales pushed into Marino territory, hijacking trucks, skimming from union jobs. Bloodshed was inevitable. One night, Anthony was ordered to send a message. The target, Tony Vitali's cousin, a mid-level enforcer. Anthony and two soldiers waited outside a bar in Queens. When the man stumbled out, half drunk, Anthony stepped forward. "Your cousin sends his regards," Anthony said calmly before emptying 3 bullets into the man's chest. The war ignited. Drive-by shootings, bombed cars, bodies in dumpsters. For months, New York was a battlefield. Anthony proved himself ruthless, calculating. He never hesitated, never missed. By 23, his reputation was solidified. Anthony Marino was not just another soldier, he was a rising predator. Climbing the ladder. After the Vitali War ended in blood and ashes, Don Carmine called Anthony into his office. "You've done well, figlio mio," the Don said, pouring him a glass of Chianti. "You've shown loyalty, strength, intelligence. Men fear you. That is good. Fear keeps order. But remember, respect is stronger than fear. If men respect you, they will follow you anywhere." Carmine leaned closer. "Romano tells me you're ready. From today, you're not just a soldier. You'll run your own crew. A capo regime. Do not disappoint me." Anthony felt the weight of the moment. A capo regime meant power, responsibility, wealth. It meant soldiers under his command, money flowing directly to him before it went to the Don. He raised his glass. "I won't disappoint you, Don Carmine." And he meant it. Building his empire. With his new status, Anthony expanded fast. He took over several gambling dens, partnered with corrupt union leaders, and began smuggling stolen goods through the docks. Every move was calculated, every risk measured. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something permanent. His soldiers, men who once doubted him, now followed him with blind loyalty. They called him Tony the Ghost, because he always struck silently, leaving nothing but whispers behind. But power always came at a price. The more Anthony rose, the more enemies circled in the dark. Rival families, jealous captains, even men inside the Marino organization began watching him with suspicion. Romano warned him, "The higher you climb, the sharper the knives waiting for your back." Anthony smiled. "Then let them come. I'll climb higher still." Part 2 ends here, with Anthony Marino stepping into power as a capo regime. The stage is set for the bloody wars and betrayals that will follow in Part 3. But the Vitales struck back harder. They bombed a Marino-owned nightclub, killing 3 innocent civilians. Newspapers screamed Mafia bloodbath in Brooklyn. Politicians called for a crackdown. The FBI began circling like vultures. Anthony knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about dominance. Shadows of betrayal. Wars don't only kill enemies, they rot families from within. In 1973, Anthony discovered that one of his closest soldiers, Frankie Bellomo, had been feeding information to the Vitales. Frankie had grown greedy, pocketing money and selling secrets. Anthony invited him to dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant. Wine flowed, laughter filled the room, and Frankie thought he was safe. Then Anthony leaned in and whispered, "I trusted you, Frankie." Frankie's smile froze. The table fell silent. Two of Anthony's men pulled him out back. Moments later, the muffled sound of a pistol ended the betrayal. His body was left in the trunk of his own car, parked on a Queen street. Anthony felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. Every betrayal chipped away at his soul. But weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. The FBI closes in. The escalating violence drew the full attention of law enforcement. Federal agents tapped phones, planted bugs in social clubs, tailed soldiers day and night. One morning, Anthony's crew narrowly escaped an FBI raid on a gambling den. He knew the feds weren't just after soldiers, they were aiming for captains. For him, Romano, his mentor, pulled him aside. "You need to be careful, Tony. Wars attract heat. Heat brings indictments. You want to end up like Gallo, bleeding on the floor of a restaurant." Anthony smirked. Better to bleed a king than live as a servant. But behind his smile, he felt the noose tightening. The price of power. By 1975, the war reached its peak. Dozens lay dead, businesses ruined, entire neighborhoods living in fear. One night, Anthony returned home to find Maria, his lover, waiting with tears in her eyes. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "Every day I wonder if you'll come home in a coffin. I don't want this life." Anthony took her hand, but he couldn't lie anymore. "Maria, this is who I am. This is what I was born for." She kissed him once, soft and final, then walked out. He didn't stop her. Power had cost him love, just as it had cost him peace. The turning point. The war finally ended when Don Carmine brokered a fragile peace with the Vitali family. Territories were divided, blood debts ignored, and the streets slowly returned to order. But for Anthony, nothing would ever be the same. He had buried friends, killed men he once called brothers, and lost the woman he loved. His name was feared across New York, but his soul felt hollow. Yet in the Mafia, there was no retirement, no escape. Only one path forward, higher, deeper, darker. And Anthony Marino was ready to climb. Part 3 ends here. The bloody years have scarred Anthony, but also solidified his reputation as one of the most ruthless and capable captains in New York. The stage is now set for Part 4, Power and Corruption, where he rises to his peak as a mafia boss, wielding influence over unions, politicians, and entire cities. Power and Corruption. New York City, 1978 to 1985. By now, Anthony Marino was no longer just a capo regime. He was a boss in waiting, a man whose shadow stretched across Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of Manhattan. The streets whispered his name with fear. Politicians and union leaders obeyed it with deference. He had built an empire stronger than most families could dream of. But power, like fire, always consumes the hand that holds it. The golden life. Anthony's apartment overlooked the Brooklyn waterfront. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, reflecting off polished mahogany floors. Outside, the docks teemed with shipments of smuggled goods, luxury cars, stolen electronics, and, occasionally, more sinister merchandise. Money flowed like water. Gambling dens, nightclubs, protection rackets, and dock operations funded yachts, expensive suits, and villas in Long Island. Maria had returned briefly, dazzled by his wealth, but Anthony's life had become too dangerous, too consuming. Romano warned him, "Tony, remember who you are. These men serve you for fear and money. Respect. That's harder to earn, easier to lose." Anthony smiled, polishing a gold watch. "I've earned both. And fear keeps men honest. Politics and influence. With money came influence." Anthony invested in local politicians, donated to campaigns, and manipulated union contracts. Labor leaders who once spoke boldly now trembled at his calls. At a private gala in Manhattan, Anthony met Senator DeLuca, a rising political star. Over expensive wine, they discussed community investments and partnerships. Though everyone knew the real talk was about kickbacks, favors, and silent obedience. Anthony realized that true power wasn't just in guns or streets, it was in invisible strings, pulling entire cities without ever shedding blood. The high cost. Despite the luxury, the weight of leadership pressed heavily. Every day brought new threats, rival families eyeing his empire, ambitious lieutenants seeking to overthrow him, and law enforcement closing in. Anthony's inner circle had grown, but trust became rare. Old friends whispered about deals behind his back. Every handshake could hide a knife. Romano, now older and wary, said one night, "Tony, remember, the higher you climb, the further the fall. Don't let the empire blind you." Anthony didn't answer. He was already calculating the next move, who needed loyalty checks, which deals could be expanded, and which threats needed silencing. Extravagance and isolation. Anthony's lifestyle became legendary. Private jets carried him to Monte Carlo, Las Vegas, and Sicily. His wardrobe rivaled kings. Parties were lavish, women adored him, and his name graced tabloids. But behind the golden masks, isolation reigned. Sleep came with nightmares of friends killed, rivals plotting, and the ghosts of the past. Maria had left for good, unable to live under the shadow of blood and fear. Even Anthony's most loyal soldiers sensed the change. He was distant, calculating, colder. Power had corrupted not only the streets but his soul. Seeds of betrayal. Ambition attracts enemies, both outside and within. By 1982, whispers of betrayal reached Anthony. Frankie Moretti, a promising lieutenant, had been meeting with a rival family. Anthony arranged a discreet meeting. The discussion was polite, but the air was tense. "You've grown ambitious, Frankie," Anthony said, voice calm. "Ambition is fine. Disloyalty isn't." Frankie smiled nervously. Then Anthony signaled 2 soldiers. Within moments, Frankie's fate was sealed. A warning for the others, but a reminder to Anthony himself. Trust was a luxury he no longer possessed. The empire at its peak. By 1985, Anthony controlled more than Brooklyn. He influenced unions, banks, politicians, and even law enforcement. His name alone could stop construction projects, sway elections, or eliminate rivals. From the outside, it seemed Anthony had achieved everything. Wealth, power, respect, fear, all in his grasp. But inside, he felt the first cracks. The loneliness, the constant vigilance, the lives lost under his command. The higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. Romano, sitting beside him one night on a private yacht, said, "Tony, be careful. Empires built on blood are unstable. One wrong step and it all collapses." Anthony stared at the city lights across the water. "Then I will step carefully, or I will step on anyone who stands in my way." The words were firm. The resolve was real. But even he could not see the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The fall. New York City, 1986 to 1990. The streets of Brooklyn had changed. Neon lights flickered over quiet alleys. The docks were emptier, and whispers of the old families had turned into echoes of a bygone era. Anthony Marino, once untouchable, felt the first tremors of collapse. The FBI had been patient, building cases over years. Wiretaps, hidden cameras, informants from within, every crime, every meeting, every payment traced meticulously. The empire Anthony had built with blood and cunning was now a target. The first strike. It started quietly. Anthony's gambling operations were raided. His warehouses inspected. Soldiers were arrested for minor infractions, pressured to talk. Anthony realized too late that even loyalty had limits. Some men would betray under pressure. One evening, Romano appeared, face pale and tense. "They've got men inside, Tony," he whispered. "I've been hearing chatter. Frankie's old crew, someone's talking." Anthony clenched his fists. "Then we strike first." But strikes were no longer as easy. The law had learned, adapted. Each move was anticipated. Betrayal within. The first real betrayal came from Vinny Esposito, a trusted lieutenant who had grown greedy and impatient. Vinny had been feeding information to the FBI in exchange for immunity. Anthony confronted him in a parking garage. Gun drawn, rain drizzling over the asphalt, Anthony demanded answers. Vinny confessed, voice trembling. Anthony didn't flinch. "You made your choice," he said. 2 shots echoed, and Vinny slumped to the ground. It was a hollow victory. Every betrayal reminded Anthony that fear could only protect him so long. The legal storm. By 1988, indictments hit. Anthony faced charges ranging from racketeering to murder. The trial was public, brutal, and humiliating. Newspapers painted him as the face of Brooklyn's criminal underworld. In court, Anthony sat tall, expression calm, but inside a storm raged. Every witness, every taped conversation, every hidden ledger was used against him. Friends refused to testify. Some lied. Others cooperated to save themselves. The judge's words were final. Anthony Marino was sentenced to life in federal prison without parole. Losing everything. As Anthony was led away, he glanced at the city he had ruled. His empire, once sprawling, was dismantled piece by piece. Soldiers were in prison, businesses seized, political allies gone. Even Maria, who had long since left him, heard the news. The love he had once clung to, the one tethered to his humanity, was gone. The man who had built power from nothing now had nothing but walls, bars, and memories. Reflection in darkness. Prison was cold, silent, and unyielding. Anthony spent nights staring at the ceiling, thinking of the streets, the blood, the choices that led him here. He realized the truth every crime boss eventually learns. Empires built on fear and blood cannot last forever. Romano's words echoed in his mind. Empires built on blood are unstable. One wrong step and it all collapses. Anthony had stepped carefully, but the world had shifted. The laws of men, the loyalty of friends, and the inevitability of justice had all converged. And in that final realization, Anthony Marino understood that the cost of ambition had been higher than he had ever imagined. Epilogue. Outside, Brooklyn continued its life. New families rose, new bosses took control, and the city never stopped moving. Anthony Marino became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of alleyways and backrooms. His life had been one of power, wealth, fear, and respect, but it had ended in silence, behind prison walls, far from the golden life he once ruled. The streets remembered him, but the man who had wielded fear and loyalty like weapons was gone, leaving only a legacy written in blood.